If I could just ask everyone, before we get started, firstly, welcome to the Poverty Alliance annual conference and this workshop on paid work, poverty and the coronavirus. My name is Jack Evans. I'll be the chair of this workshop and I'm the Living Wage Scotland manager at the Poverty Alliance. Just before we get started on the house rules, if I could just ask everyone to mute themselves, as this is a meeting, not a webinar. And also this event is going to be recorded and put on the Poverty Alliance website. So I'd also ask if you could turn off your cameras as well, that'd be fantastic. Throughout this workshop, I would ask you all to use the chat function to submit any questions, which we'll be asking after the three panelists have given their presentations. Also, just one last bit, some fail-safe, in case of any tech issues on my end, the meeting will be restarted by a backup host. If you could all just wait patiently and you'll be readmitted back into the meeting. So just to reiterate, cameras off, microphones off, and submit questions via the chat function. Today, we're going to hear from three experts about what their experience tells us about the way the labour market is working and what we need to do to ensure that unemployment and low pay do not become further entrenched and hallmarks of the recovery from the coronavirus. There are three broad aims for this workshop: to reflect on the impact of COVID on paid work, particularly on low paid and insecure work, to look at what ongoing impact may be over the next 6 months, and to consider what some of the long-term policy changes may be needed. Today, we're luckily going to hear from Laura Gardiner, the director of the Living Wage Foundation. And the Living Wage Foundation is the organisation at the heart of the independent movement of businesses and people that campaign on the idea that a hard day's work deserves a fair day's pay. Pheona Matovu, director of Radiate and Brighter. And Radiate and Brighter provide orientation and integration classes, training and employment, business startup and diversity training to organisations and individuals, as well as hosting women's groups, talent groups, providing support to the community with a specific emphasis on asylum seekers, refugees and migrants in Scotland. Finally, we'll hear from Alex Warren, the Director of Strategy at the Wise Group. The Wise Group is a leading social enterprise and they support people into jobs, tackle fuel poverty and help those leaving prison. So, with the introductions out the way, I would like to first introduce Laura Gardiner from the Living Wage Foundation to start her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jack, and thanks very much for having me at your conference today. Really looking forward to hearing from you all in the questions. I'm just going to share my screen, if you'll bear with me. I'm going to assume that Jack will give me a shout if anything isn't working. I've got a thumbs up, so that's a good start. So I've got a few slides here today. As Jack mentioned, I'm director of the resolution here we go, I'm already getting it wrong. I'm director of the Living Wage Foundation as maternity cover. For the last 6.5 years, I've been working at a think tank called the Resolution Foundation, which focuses on living standards for people on lower middle incomes, and this is only my second week at the Living Wage Foundation. So although I've left the ivory towers and spreadsheets and statistical software of the Resolution Foundation for a charity that does some really good things on the ground, I haven't totally weaned myself off yet. So in my presentation today, I've stolen a few of my charts from the Resolution Foundation because I do love a chart, to talk about the impact of the coronavirus crisis on the labour market so far, particularly in terms of low paid work and what might happen next. And that's kind of been that was the focus of my work at the Resolution Foundation for the last 6 months. So I'll be talking both about kind of about that, but also of course about what we do at the Living Wage Foundation, which I'll come back to at the end. In my presentation today, I'm going to kind of cover three topics briefly. I'm going to first talk about what we can see in the statistical evidence in terms of the impact of the coronavirus crisis so far on the labour market, and particularly on low paid work. I'm then going to talk about what the signs show maybe to come in terms of the ongoing and future labour market impacts. And finally, I'll turn to what I think the response should be, both from governments, the UK and the Scottish level, and from businesses and other actors. So I will go straight into my first section, which is considering the impact of the coronavirus crisis on the jobs market so far. And given the kind of the interest we all have attending this conference, it won't be at all surprising to know that the picture is quite worrying, both in terms of the size of the impacts of the crisis on the jobs market, and particularly the lockdown, but also the distribution of those impacts by earnings. So this is one of my favourite charts from the Resolution Foundation that we've been using a lot over the past few months. And what it shows is rates of kind of what you might consider negative labour market effects resulting from the coronavirus crisis. So furloughing in blue, job loss in red, and reduced hours in green, and it shows those rates across the 5 quintiles of the earnings distribution. And the really clear picture is that the lowest paid have been hardest hit. So up there we've got more than, and this is data from kind of the middle of lockdown in April, we've got more than 2/5 of all workers in the bottom fifth of earnings having either been furloughed, lost their job altogether, or taken hours and associated pay cuts. So that's kind of a really worrying starting point. In terms of considering what has driven this, I think the thing I've said most over the past 6 months, and the thing that Jack asked me to talk about today a little bit, is it's all about sectors of the economy. And this shouldn't be a surprise. We've all just kind of lived through, and are continuing to live through, lockdowns, restrictions on ongoing social distancing measures. And we know that those affect some parts of the economy far more than others. So it's kind of face-to-face service industries that have been far more affected in comparison to kind of essential industries like health that have kept on going, and other parts of the economy, possibly those that lots of us are in, which have been able to carry on roughly as normal once we got used to working from home. So this chart here is one of many ways of bringing that to life. It shows the drop in vacancies in different sectors of the economy in the early couple of months of the crisis. So you kind of got vacancies almost disappearing entirely at the top there in some important face-to-face industries, particularly hospitality and arts and leisure. Now, the reason why this is important is because those sectors are typically lower paying, and they typically employ certain groups in the economy, particularly young people. So it's the fact that this crisis has had such differential effects by sector. We compared the levels of difference of those effects to the financial crisis. The sectoral difference is at least 6 times larger this time round. So feels much more different than normal, this recession, depending on where you are in the economy. It's that difference and the fact that the biggest effects have been in the lowest pay, in the sectors of the economy that contain a lot of low paid jobs. This is the biggest explainer of kind of all the outcomes we're seeing in the labour market. And kind of my final kind of chart I pulled out from my old job in terms of what's happened so far is just a note to say that it does look as if Scotland has been among the hardest hit, certainly in the lockdown period, from these early effects. So this is kind of the same chart as I showed you on my first slide, split up by the regions and nations of the UK or Great Britain. And it shows that Scotland's up the top there, and in particular had the highest rate of job loss in the early months of lockdown. Now, one thing we might expect is that regions and nations that have more employees in the private sector might be more likely to have high rates of furloughing, high rates of job loss, with the public sector more protected. And so Scotland's kind of particularly interesting in that regard because it's got one of the lower rates, which you can see on the right hand side, of employees in the private sector. So I haven't myself, and I look forward to hearing from others that know lots more about the Scottish context, because I haven't myself totally got to the bottom of this, but it looks as if kind of the combination of being in a low paid sector and being in Scotland might have driven some particularly worrying effects in the early months of this crisis. So if that's kind of a very brief picture of what happened initially in the labour market, with furloughing, which was driven by kind of national UK government policy response, obviously having a really big effect there, then what might we be expecting to happen next? particularly as the furlough scheme is being withdrawn and replaced with kind of less generous and probably lower take-up schemes. And my main message here is that the kind of the thing I've been saying so far, that it's all about sectors, continues, because even if well, we might not be, but even if we're now out of lockdown or into a more open economy, the kind of social distancing restrictions are continuing to have much bigger effects in some sectors than others. So what this chart here is kind of a little bit complicated, but what it shows is some clever former colleagues at the Resolution Foundation have used Google Mobility Trends data from other countries that opened up earlier than the UK to try and kind of model and predict what level of output different sectors of the economy will get to as we move through 2020 and reopen. And the clear message is that it's some of these key face-to-face low-paying sectors like hospitality and arts and recreation that take the longest to get back up. And you can see they kind of settle at kind of a permanently lower level. So maybe 10% down on normal levels of activity, even once we're reopened. And this model was assuming we would be reopened by the end of the year. Maybe that looks overly optimistic now because we did this a couple of months ago. That kind of 10% down continues until there's a vaccine or effective treatment. So the key message here is that the kind of sectoral differentiation that drove the initial effects is going to be ongoing, and the pressure is going to remain on those particularly low, on those sectors in which lots of low paid people find themselves. And with the furlough scheme being wound up to the end of October, it's no surprise, therefore, given those ongoing pressures, and those are coming from both restrictions, so restaurants being told they need to have fewer tables in than they did before, and by many of our reticence to go out and do the same kind of hospitality and leisure activities that we might have before the crisis. Because of those ongoing pressures, it's no surprise that the headlines have been dominated by jobs being lost in those sectors. So we're moving from a situation in which low paid workers have been disproportionately likely to be affected in some ways, although quite adequately supported, although many have fallen through the cracks, by the furlough scheme, which has had a huge effect on the labour market, to job loss and redundancy in very large numbers, concentrated in low-paying service sectors through the autumn and winter. But, you know, so I always risk in presentations, particularly at the moment, being incredibly negative from start to finish. And so it's always good to try and have a bit of levity. And so this is just to point out that, again, because of everything I've said about the differences between sectors, it's not all bad news. These are just kind of a few things I've pulled out from recent reports I've read. So the chart on the left is from the REC report on jobs, and I won't go into detail on what it shows, but it shows there's some bits of the economy like IT and computing, like engineering, like the financial services, and like health and care, where vacancies are growing. And the kind of the CBI, the business group, similarly highlights the kind of two-speed economy we've now got. So some parts of the economy, particularly those in which there are lots of low-paid jobs, really struggling. Others actually maybe having quite a quick recovery and being areas where we might see some jobs growth, and where we might be able to kind of think about putting pressure to make sure that terms and conditions and pay and so forth are serving the needs of lower paid workers, and doing everything we can to combat in-work poverty. So the kind of theme of it's very different depending on which sector you're in really does run through my presentation, I'm afraid. So with my last couple of minutes, I'll just kind of opine on what I think this tells us. Now, I should say these aren't the views of the Living Wage Foundation. I've kind of pulled these out from a kind of number of different perspectives. So these are kind of just suggestions that we might want to consider, rather than a definite prescription from the Living Wage Foundation. But I think we can take from this a couple of things. I think in terms of what either the UK government or devolved administrations might want to consider as a policy response, the two things I'd point out are, I've talked a lot about kind of those low paid sectors where the crisis has really kind of reduced jobs, and the lockdowns kind of shut down activity. But at the same time, we've had other bits of the economy that also contain a lot of low paid workers that have really borne the greatest health risks. Those where key workers are focused, particularly sectors like social care, also people working in supermarkets and things like that. So we've had some low-paid workers suffering huge economic risks with their sectors shut down, and others kind of keeping the country going, facing the greatest health risks. And so government at all levels does need to reflect that when we think about how we build out of this crisis. So I think kind of how to crystallize that. Well, the first thing I've been thinking about is in the recovery effort, we will need government investment to drive job creation if jobs in existing sectors are potentially under threat. The Resolution Foundation's been encouraging government to think about growing sectors like social care and also green jobs, but green jobs that are accessible to people with a range of qualification levels, like, for example, home retrofitting. We need to focus on those being good jobs. And similarly, in initiatives like Kickstart and the Youth Guarantee in Scotland, the minimum prescriptions, I think, can be improved upon to make sure that the pay and hours reflect good jobs that can really give people a start in their careers. Second category of things I'd think about is kind of reflecting the both economic and health risks that lower paid and more insecure workers have borne during this crisis. Now is a really important time, despite the economic challenges, to think about extension and enforcement of rights for those groups. So the fact that many low earners don't get any sick pay is a travesty, and there's a government consultation out there on how that could be rectified that just hasn't been acted on, a UK UK government consultation. We can also look at things about protection against unfair dismissals and bringing our patchwork enforcement, labour market enforcement system with kind of a different body dealing with the minimum wage abuse versus health and safety and other things together into a much more proactive single enforcement body. And finally, I think, we talk quite a lot about low pay, but it's especially kind of given the turbulence of this pandemic, we really need to be thinking more about security and control. And so the Resolution Foundation has long been recommending some kind of sensible and pragmatic moves in that direction at the policy level. Things like a right to a contract that reflects actual hours of work, greater advance notice of work schedules and compensation when those are changed at the last minute. These are not particularly radical ideas, but in a strong labour market such as the UK has had in recent years, these are the right things to be thinking about to balance rights and flexibility, in my view. So that's kind of a flavour of what I think governments could be considering. I will finish very quickly by, of course, tacking back to what kind of we do at the Living Wage Foundation in our day-to-day. So I think it's really important to highlight that it's not just about the national policy response. There's also loads that businesses can do, particularly right now, perhaps those businesses in those sectors that haven't been so hard hit in the economy, and particularly linking back up to the national policy response, what can be done in those sectors that are quite reliant on government funding for the way they're structured, like social care. So businesses can accredit to the living wage. We have over 6,500 businesses accredited across the UK, with a particular presence in Scotland. And our new campaign, Living Hours, reflects many of the things I said on the previous slide in terms of a pragmatic set of standards businesses can sign up to, including a right to a 4 weeks notice of shifts and contracts of at least 16 hours unless the worker wants otherwise. So I think our kind of movement, which is coming up to its 20th birthday next year, has shown the success of those employers who want to do the right thing, working together to do so. We do expect challenging times for many of the businesses in our network, but we've continued to grow through the pandemic. I think as people recognise the effort and the sacrifice that many lower paid workers have made, and the need to recognise that and join a movement of businesses that seek to offer decent pay levels and decent security for their entire workforces. So please do get in touch with us if you're interested in finding out more about accrediting to the living wage or living hours. Meanwhile, I will hand back to Jack, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you, Laura. That was wonderful. Also, yeah, please get in touch with the Poverty Alliance if you're based in Scotland to discuss more of the living wage accreditation issues. It'd be great to hear from as many of you as possible. We're going to move on now to Pheona. So I'm going to mute myself and Pheona, if you could get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Laura, for that very insightful information. As I start, I just want us to think, because I think that we are all only going to make progress if we look at this as societal, as something that we can all do. I do realize that systems, processes, and agencies need to make a difference, need to move forward, need to bring the challenges and perhaps the solutions to the fore and to lead us in so many ways. But it is important that each one of us is thinking about what is our role, what part can we play. And so I want to start off by stating what has been said several times and what government is saying. What does building back better mean to you? And with that question in mind, keep it at the back of your mind. I'll come back to it later, but I'll just tell you, Radiant and Brighter, our work has primarily been with minority ethnic groups, looking at the challenges, the difficulties, the barriers, and the issues that plague our community. And some of what we have already had, what COVID has shone a light on the inequalities and the challenges and the difficulties, the unemployment, the minority ethnic groups that are at the forefront of the pandemic, working and the illnesses. But I want us to look specifically at Scotland. I want to speak in the Scottish context. At the early stages of the pandemic, we did very significantly recognize across the world, particularly about racism. And I want to touch on that because I think that when we talk about employment and jobs and the young people and women, I don't want us to forget that for the barriers and the experiences that we have, racism is often at the back of our minds. It's often in the design, it's often in the way we respond. And so I want to bring that to the fore and get us thinking about how we challenge that, how we change that, and how we ensure that the systems, the processes, and the design of how we respond post-pandemic, how we ensure that racism is not embedded in the design and in our responses. Because frankly, and if we look at it worldwide, we do know that migrants from particularly African and Asian countries, but all across the world, will experience exclusion from work, will be discriminated from work, not just because people don't like them, because not just because somebody's going to call them the N-word, but also because the systems say, we do not want you to work, we do not accept your contribution, because you're a refugee, because you're an asylum seeker, we don't think you have much to contribute until we've allowed you to contribute. So when we're talking about employment, we need to think, do we appreciate that refugees, asylum seekers, and minority ethnic groups and migrants do have something to bring to the economy? And again, I want us to focus on Scotland, because Scotland has a unique perspective on this. We do know that last year, FSB, the Federation for Small Business, did a research piece that showed that migrants contribute 13 billion to the Scottish economy every single year. And yet we also know that asylum seekers and some migrants are not allowed to work. And I do understand that when we bring this up, it says the response is it's a UK issue, it's not a devolved issue. But what can we do in Scotland to ensure that something is changed? Because we know that in places like Canada and the USA, you are allowed to work when you arrive in the country, and therefore you're able to participate. And so when we're speaking about inequalities, we're speaking about poverty, we're speaking about employment, I want us to think, what could migrants contribute? How much are we losing from refugees, from asylum seekers and undocumented migrants who come here with skills, qualifications, talents that are not applied, that are not appreciated within our economy? And so Scotland, before COVID, we knew, because we did a research as well, we commissioned a research as Radiant and Brighter, which reached out to 250 people within the workplace. And we found the same things that we have always known, which is there is no career progression routes for minority ethnic groups. Particularly, they are stuck. What we have is sticky floors, and I will not use glass ceilings, I'll call concrete ceiling, because you are often allowed to work as a cleaner, as a carer, as a security guard. For those that are men, or those are the jobs that you get. You're at the forefront and at the bottom of the rank, regardless of whether you came here as a doctor, as a skilled nurse, as a banker, it does not matter. And so we need to think about what career progression routes have we got in the workplace. I do know that we are all hit, and therefore we have to think about employment opportunities. But when we're thinking about that, are we thinking about diversity? Are we thinking about diversity of ethnicity specifically? So we know that groups are underemployed. The recruitment practices exclude them. There is a skills mismatch. There is abuse and exploitation in the workplace. Indeed, we are the last in and the first out. And so when the pandemic hit, it's the minority ethnic groups that were the first to be let go. And prior to that, they would have been working in 0-hour contracts. And that's if they're lucky to be working. Otherwise, they have no recourse to public funds and are not allowed to work. And so when we're talking about young people, we need to, what are we showing them? Because young people, once they've graduated, we know that they perform very highly in school. And once they've graduated, the opportunities are still lacking. And so they are left with either having to leave Scotland to go and search for pastures greener where there is perhaps more appreciation of diversity, or stay here and risk being underemployed, unappreciated, and continue to face racism in the workplace. So we need to look at our recruitment processes. At the moment, they are flawed, where highly qualified people are unable to get an interview, and cautious bias appears to play in every stage of recruitment, and there is blatant racism even from customers, which is not addressed or dealt with in the workplace. So I come back to the question, when we say building back better, what are we thinking? We need to be thinking about a complete overhaul, a complete new way of looking at people that are currently being othered. We need to be thinking about how the structures respond to the current system and the current challenges. We do know that, yes, the pandemic has shone a light, but historically, this has been a crisis. It's been a pandemic waiting to happen for ethnic groups. I know because as a person of minority ethnic background, I did experience no recourse to public funds. I was not allowed to work due to immigration controls for a good part of 5 years. I had to depend on the community, and I knew that I could bring something. I had worked before in London, and I had worked previously until my immigration status became a challenge. And in that period, we had to depend on family, friends, and everybody that could listen to us. Sadly, at the time, charities and all organizations that worked with minority ethnic groups did not recognize that we were eligible for support, because we did not tick a particular box, and therefore we were not categorized in the funding opportunities that organizations got. So what do we do going forward? We need to think about the solutions to the challenges that we face, the solutions to the challenges that minority ethnic groups face, but also we need to be thinking about opportunities. Because it's not just about the barriers. For every barrier that everybody else experiences, we experience a lot more. When we think about the opportunities, we know now in the work that I have been doing and that we do with Radiant and Brighter, that even when the opportunities are available at the top tier jobs, people do not apply. There are several reasons, but I'll cite two important reasons. One of the reasons is because it is not for them. We are saying, you know what, we have white snowy peaks where you do not belong, where you cannot apply, you cannot be part of us. And so people may not necessarily apply because the systems say we cannot appreciate your value. The The second reason I will cite is the fact that opportunities are not made available for minority ethnic groups and indeed for young people all the way from high school through to education. While at school, in high school, you can get perhaps some opportunities. We know that the engagement within high school is not from other agencies, is not reaching minority ethnic young people in the way that they should. So they are not able to step up. They are not allowed to be part and parcel. And even if they were, the fact that they experience racism means that they do not want to be the focus of attention any more than they already are. Having experienced negative attention, they are afraid to stand up and to be part and parcel of the participation. And so as they get into work, that is only exasperated by the experiences in the workplace. So going forward, we have the race equality framework. I would like to ask anybody whether you've heard of it and what you think it has done, because I am not sure I am involved in that work. And I think the reason for that is because we have statements of intent. We have the diversity and inclusion policies on our shelves. We have the race equality framework. We know what it should do, but when it comes down to doing something, I don't know what happens, but I would like to put that question to you. Perhaps I know some reasons, but I would like to leave us thinking about why that remains a statement of intent and does not translate into policies. So if you're here and you're in the decision-making process, position, I'd like to ask you, what decisions could we make, and what decisions have you made, and who have you reached out to ensure that these policies are translated into action? So building back better means changing the narrative. We need to work better. We need to allow minority ethnic groups to contribute. We have almost become used to statements such as minority ethnic groups are less likely to get into employment. And so I wanted to bring us back to not just those statements, but actually bringing it to a stage and a level where we humanize that. We have desensitized from the statements that we make, but we need to humanize that because it's people's lives. And we are talking about these things and doing nothing at the cost and at the expense of young people, of women of color, and of real lives of minority ethnic groups. And so it is important that we all participate in the growth of the economy. And when we speak about inclusive growth, we need to consider the importance and the value minority ethnic groups can bring to the table. As we do that, we need to include lived experience expertise at the design stage, not at the 11th hour, as we are often called to speak and to engage with the research at the end, with the design at the end, where we cannot make any changes, and we are still going to be challenged. And so I will leave us there thinking, and with that, I want to say, as we move forward, we need to be clear on the time investment and the financial investment, particularly from government and from other funding agencies. Why? Because at the moment, we've looked at the statement for what the government is intending to do going forward, but the program for government does not really state how much is going to go into into bringing about the change of the issues and the inequalities around employment, around business startup. And we know business startup is a quicker route into employment for minority ethnic groups, indeed for migrants. But what is government doing to ensure that those pathways are made available? What investment is being made into that? Or are we going to continue telling the story over and over, doing the same things and expecting to get a different result? So I will leave you there thinking about that. And with that, I want to say that if we want to grow, develop, and change and challenge and have a new way forward in these very uncertain times, we need everybody to participate, regardless of where they come from, who they are. We need every person to be part and parcel of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Fiona. That was wonderful. There's a few questions piling up, and I've got a few of my own, but we will come back to you and Laura after we hear from Alex from the WISE group. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Jack. Let me just, I've got a few slides to share, so if you can give me a thumbs up if that's worked for you, that'd be great. Great, cool. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to join the session today and share the experiences of the WISE group. And unsurprisingly, it's been really powerful to hear both Laura and Fiona talk about the impacts and the insight that they've given us. And I think, you know, hopefully this session and everything that's happened this week during the Poverty Alliance conference has thrown up some really important questions, particularly for decision makers across Scotland and the UK and the world about what we're experiencing at the moment. So hopefully I can incite some more of those questions with my short ramble here as well. So Peter, Jack and the team at the Poverty Alliance have asked me to talk about the experiences of the WISE group and our customers in light of COVID and the impact that this has had and the impact it's likely to have going forward. Here we go. So those that know us will be aware that we deliver a wide range of support to vulnerable customers to lift people out of poverty. Within a normal year, we'll engage with upwards of 30,000 individuals across the programmes which we deliver across Scotland and different parts of England as well. These programmes range from supporting people with employability, which I'll talk about in more detail today, our mentoring services to reduce reoffending across the justice system, our skills and training delivery to build people's skills and confidence, and also our large-scale work to eradicate fuel poverty. So we have specific expertise on supporting people with employability. This is focused on helping people to break down barriers, build up confidence and skills to move into the world of work. And we've been doing this since the WISE group started in 1983. So it's pretty safe to say that we've got wide-ranging experience of delivering employability support and devising and delivering programs to tackle unemployment and support people back towards work. We had and we currently do deliver large-scale services and contracts like Fair Start Scotland, again, which I'll talk about a bit more in detail. But we also design and deliver our own programs with partners and at different scales to support people back towards work. And as an organisation, we've seen, and we've even actually been involved in shaping the world of employment support over the past few decades. We've seen massive large-scale programs being devised, but more recently, pre-COVID, we've actually seen a slowing of support as Scotland and the rest of the UK saw employment levels reach record highs. So pre-COVID, we were seeing the types of programs that we've historically delivered and the specific policy and investment around these shift a little and slow down. Those, as employment levels remained high, there was a much larger focus on things like in-work poverty and underemployment as these were key growing issues. And they also remain to be key issues. But now the picture's changed. So I wanted to, you know, as per the brief I was given, put all of this in the context of the current pandemic and the crisis around employment. And everyone at this session knows, and it's already been talked about, this is a pretty scary picture. So who does COVID affect the most? You know, I'm covering old ground and there's no surprises here, but Laura and Pheona have talked articulately about this. You know, we know the virus itself hits certain groups the hardest, the elderly, those with underlying health conditions, etc. But from an economic point of view, there's a slightly different picture. It's actually, you know, different groups, the youngest, young people, young economically active people who are hit the most in terms of job prospects, those from minority ethnic groups, those in lower paid jobs who are hardest hit. COVID has shone a bright light, a spotlight on inequality. For example, the lowest paid workers, but you know, as Laura had said, some of those that are delivering some of the most critical roles across our society, these are roles which can't be performed remotely or working from home just isn't an option. These have had the biggest hit. We've seen fewer hours being worked across a lot of sectors. Household incomes are being squeezed like never before. And poverty has a multiplier effect on the impact of COVID. but I know this is not news to most people engaging in this session. And lots of this has been talked about already today in great detail over the week as well. But it makes me think back to a statement that I heard a number of months back as we were deep in lockdown. And it was the one that's at the bottom of this slide, that's the best protection against COVID is not to be poor. And that really hit me hard because it's stark, but it's actually, sadly quite an accurate statement. So who are the people that we support? We are seeing the profile of our customers change as the impact of the pandemic unfolds. Particularly as we see the end of the job retention scheme, we see the profile of unemployment numbers change. We've got a long history of working with those, and we've got an understanding of those who face multiple barriers to employment, and those people that need intense support to get back towards the labour market. And our work across sectors has represented a key alignment with the Scottish Government's No One Left Behind manifesto piece. But now we keep hearing, and we're seeing, and some of Laura's graphs showed, there's a term that I've heard a lot, a tsunami of job seekers who will be unemployed and in need of support. And we've seen, and this is likely to be true, and we're seeing this already, and we're going to see people who thought they would never lose their jobs, who need help. We've got people who have never had any real interaction with the welfare system suddenly arrive at their local job centre plus, or identify at services needing help. So this profile change of our customers and the landscape of those needing help towards employment is a real watch out for all of us. And there's a myriad of employability support programmes operating across the UK, which will be able to help some of these people. And there's many new programmes to come, and I'll touch on this shortly in my talk. But how do we do this without it being as a cost? And this cost being further marginalisation of the people who we've been focused on helping in the past, those furthest removed from the labour market. These are the groups at risk of being squeezed out even further by the sheer numbers of people who will access support, gain re-employment, access reskilling and retraining opportunities. Our big question, and the question we must continually pose to policymakers, is how do we ensure that those who were left behind in that old sense don't end up being further left behind? The imperative must be on finding a twin track economic and social recovery. More broadly, as civic challenges heighten, displacement has got to be our key watch out. We must not forget those people who are already struggling, who were already struggling before the pandemic. And I have to say that some of what we've seen so far, particularly in Scotland, is really encouraging. And we've hugely welcomed the increased focus on people and place principles, such as community wealth building across Scotland. And it's been great to see leaders in this, such as North Ayrshire Council, with their commitments and stating their commitments to this approach. But if we focus a moment on those, on the help that is needed for those recently unemployed as a result of COVID, and those who are going to need help getting back into work, it pushes us to ask questions around what type of support these people will really need, and how is it best delivered to suit those needs. We're very rapidly developing this insight as a sector and as a country, and some of the delivery in this has started to happen as the situation unfolds. But some of those now in need of support will need services to look and feel quite different in order to be well utilised and impactful. So what do we understand about the propensities of this new and diverse customer group in terms of employability, and those who are not accustomed to engaging with the welfare system or classic welfare to work programmes? These are all key questions we must ask and try to understand, so that we design and deliver services that are impactful and that the investment goes in where it makes a real difference. And we need to focus on what success looks like. Some of our most successful programmes are measured by behaviour change and progression, more in line with Scotland's National Performance Framework principles, not on numbers or units. So they're person-centred and impact-centred rather than spreadsheet or contract-centred. Now, this is evidence that with the correct relationship, motivation and collaboration, it's possible from a design and procurement perspective to have success like this. COVID offers the perfect opportunity to rebalance a future operating model through trusted partnerships and change success factors. During the COVID period and before, the third sector has acted with pace and in many cases is the innovator, offering funders and government departments new ways of delivering their obligations. I can't talk about service design and future need without noting the massive issue on digital exclusion. And I'm sure that this needs no explanation to this group. But as COVID restrictions continue to evolve and remain relevant for us all, we can't avoid the inevitable need for continued remote delivery of services. But without digital access, and importantly, without digital capability and confidence, it leaves some of the most vulnerable shut out and paralysed. The complexities across sectors as well continues to throw up questions and considerations that need to be addressed and solved. For example, just think about what's happened recently with exam grades, and then the impact that COVID has had on universities and colleges. Many young people have had grades that have allowed them to suddenly make different choices from before, perhaps opting for university when they were planning to go to college previously. But with universities worrying about dropout rates from this group being far higher than normal, or other reports of the growing number of young people choosing not to go to university in the first place, as fees remain in some parts of the UK, but the learning becomes different, entirely remote, not what some of these young people have signed up for. So they're now opting to go straight for a job or other vocational training. So this is just one element that will put a further squeeze on the job market for young people and other groups. Coming back to the programmes and the support we currently deliver, I mean, one of the biggest programmes we deliver is Fair Start Scotland on behalf of the Scottish Government. Now, this is already a programme that supports a large number of people back into work, and we're seeing the service get busier, as you'd imagine. Many will have seen that the Scottish Government have extended the programme for a further 2 years, and we can expect to see the volumes on Fair Start Scotland and other equivalent programmes across the UK continue to rise. We'll likely see the profile of our customers change too. We're already seeing that. So we know that unemployment levels will rise to record highs and the number of people needing support will be challenging. So what's the policy and government reaction been to this so far? What's coming over the hill in terms of employment support? And you'll see from this slide, it's a really busy picture. And apologies, you won't be able to see a lot of the detail on this slide because I realised that the text is minuscule. So like Laura, I will share this later. But hopefully the picture paints the picture for you about how busy it is. This, I'll just quickly run through. Kickstart's already been mentioned, £2 billion of support for 16 to 24-year-olds on universal credit, supporting paid work placements. Scottish Government's Youth Guarantee, the Job Finding Support Programme, a programme that's being procured at the moment of light touch support across the UK for those who are recently unemployed. The CARES framework, and apologies for the acronyms, that stands for Commercial Agreement for Employment and Health Related Support, a new default framework procured by the DWP recently that will be the delivery mechanism and the procurement mechanism for employment programmes over the next 5 years across the UK. JETS, which stands for Job Entry Targeted Support, coming to Scotland. Now, this is a programme that's already live across England through the work and health programme providers. JETS, we believe the tender for this is going to come out today, we're told. And this will be the first thing procured through the CARES framework. And that's about supporting people back into work with intensive support. There's other programmes due to be coming in the coming weeks, possibly months, in England for support for long-term unemployed people. You've then got the regional support from Job Centre Plus networks, where they're currently procuring local support, particularly through the third sector, to help people reskill, retrain, get back into work, break down barriers. And this slide just shows the new things, and just the new things that we know about. It doesn't take into consideration what's already there. We've got to think about how all of this new stuff that's being designed at very fast speeds aligns or perhaps even competes with the current provision. With things like Fair Start Scotland, with the Employability Fund, with employability pipeline provision, with the existing regional support on employability, with local grassroots programmes. So how do we map this all out and ensure that people are getting the best and most appropriate support that works for them? And for us, and I'm sure a handful of others on this session, we are supposed experts in this arena. So we should clearly understand what's going on and how best to support people through it to gain positive outcomes. But right now it's quite confusing and things are evolving really fast. So if we don't yet grasp the best way to navigate through all of this new and existing support, how can we expect people who need the help to best understand where to go? But I don't want to be negative. I'm not going to be negative. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got to focus on the advantages of this wide-ranging package of support measures that are being implemented. And we must all work out what our roles in supporting this. even if we're not involved directly in the delivery of programs like these ones on the slide, and a lot of them, because of their scale, will be delivered by very large scale providers. But we've got to understand how our planning and development fits around these to support people who need our help. So we know that there's a direct link between poverty and employment. That's not news to anybody. And we know that done right, all of this support will make a real difference to many people who need help. There are huge levels of investment right now being funneled into employment support as a key tool for economic recovery. And you can see that from that previous slide. We can all find ways to be critical of bits of this or elements of it, but ultimately we've got to see the huge benefit from this focus on it. Just look at that, the number of things from that slide, the number of things we already have and how we can mesh that together. We need an enormous push on reskilling and on reskilling and re-employment. And done effectively, it will boost opportunity and it'll stimulate the economy. And importantly, it'll provide a route out of poverty for many people. But finally, just to wrap up, I'll come back to my key watch out, our key watch out for all of this, as we continue to see new employment support and employability programs being developed at breakneck speed. We've got to make sure that by default or by design, that those who are the most marginalized and the furthest from the labor market are not displaced in all of this. That's where the key focus has got to be in our view. A twin track recovery focused on well-being and one that leaves no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was wonderful. And also 3 out of 3 for people finishing their presentations bang on time. So thank you all 3 presenters for those wonderful, incisive and concise presentations. We're going to have a wee look at some of the questions just now. There's been a couple of good ones and I have a couple as well, which I'm going to take the opportunity as chair in the next 20 minutes to ask. But I think maybe we'll come to the last question first from Graham, which is about the relationship between COVID support, self-employed people and freelancers and race. This is directed about Pheona's comment around startups and self-employment seen as quicker route to satisfactory workers, Pheona. And do you think this would still be the case, given that they've perhaps fallen through the cracks under the COVID measures? And obviously, Laura and Alex, happy if you would want to jump in as well, but Pheona, maybe if you want to have a look at that one first.
I think, yes, there is the potential to fall through the cracks under COVID measures, but I also think that there is an opportunity for us to consider greater support for business startups, especially as it does bring innovation into the picture and does create new jobs. So I think that government should be looking at how business startups are better supported, not just with support to understand the system, support to get the right information, but also investment in that area, because we know that pandemic or no pandemic, there will be people that won't get into employment because of the current systematic exclusions that exist anyway. But I do think that there is a real need, and I know, considering the research that was done and the contribution that migrants can make, I think that government should be considering investment in that area, not just through the agencies, but through community agencies as well, ensuring that any injection of investment goes directly to support people that would like to start businesses.
Thanks, Pheona. I don't know if Laura wants to join in or Alex wants to join in on that, or if we could move on to the next. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, I think we're going to go back to Lynn Anderson's question around supporting making good jobs and productivity, and what messages should be coming from government and influencers to encourage investment in good jobs, even if the returns in work productivity might not be immediately felt. And I'd ask Laura if she could maybe jump in on this one first.
Yeah, absolutely, it's a really good question. I think the first thing I'd say is that, you know, I've done lots of economic research in recent years, and productivity is king in the long run. It's the long-term driver of pay outcomes, and it's kind of the holy grail that we've been not doing such a good job on in the UK over the last decade, as we all probably know. But I think in the long run is really important there. Kind of learning from Alex's presentation, we are in all likelihood facing a really challenging unemployment picture in the coming months and years. There's loads of research that shows the scarring effects, the long-term hits to employment and pay that unemployment has when people experience it, particularly at the beginning of their careers. I really care about productivity, but it is not top of my list right now, and I worry that kind of some politicians, I should say, this is definitely a personal view, not the views of the Living Wage Foundation, some politicians talking about kind of using this moment of crisis to kind of slash and burn the old rubbish jobs and move to the kind of new better jobs, are paying too little attention to kind of the damaging effects of long periods of unemployment if we kind of go kind of full pelt of this creative destruction approach to the world. So that's the first thing I said. And then very briefly, I kind of three more specific points. I think first, when we're thinking about how the jobs that are being supported can be good and productive, both good jobs and productive jobs, we really need to recognize the value of training. So I spoke about kind of social care and accessible green jobs that don't require huge qualifications, like home retrofitting, as really important things to be thinking about in the near future to create some jobs. They need training, and that probably needs to be public sector investment in that training if they are going to be good jobs and if they're going to be productive jobs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I've talked quite a lot in my presentation about the hardest hit sectors like hospitality and arts and leisure. The fact is, and this is kind of what I was saying, while you can have fewer covers than normal in a restaurant, while you're having to do exclusively table service in a pub, while you've had to take every second treadmill out of the gym, your workers are going to be less productive. That's kind of the economic definition of productivity: less output for each hour worked. Now, we probably don't want the pubs and the gyms to go away forever. We probably expect that when there's a vaccine or an effective treatment, those will come back in force. So if we don't want to kind of destroy all that prematurely, we need to accept lower productivity in those sectors and still support jobs. And I'd suggest things like wage subsidies in those hard hit sectors would be a really important thing to look at for the government to do that. And the final thing is, I think the conversation about the kind of positive self-reinforcing feedback relationship between good jobs where we invest in pay, such as pay at least the living wage, and security, like our New Living Hours campaign, and the sort of kind of positive effects that can have on productivity. So the pay in the terms driving the productivity rather than the other way around, like economists might normally think of it. That conversation needs to continue. And to that end, we are at the Living Wage Foundation repeating a study we did in 2016 with our employer network, looking at the extent to which doing things like accrediting to the living wage and uplifting workers to it has driven positive outcomes in terms of retention, worker satisfaction, and worker productivity. So we're going to do that at the start of next year, and we'll be coming back to you with the results. But I hope that by doing so, we can kind of get right underneath the bonnet of how, even in these trying times, investing in good jobs can help achieve productivity benefits, even in a challenging landscape.
Thanks, Laura. I think that was a great answer. We've not got any more questions on the chat, but I just had a question about people progressing in work. And I guess maybe first for Pheona, but anyone else as well, happy to chime in. I think you'd mentioned about the racial discrimination being a part of employees not being able to progress in their jobs. And there was a CIPD survey last year talking about 1 in 3 Black workers citing racial discrimination as a reason for their lack of progression, a career progression. In Scotland, obviously, employment is one of these areas that's not quite as devolved as many would like. So as Pheona, what do you think employers could be doing? We engage with employers, hundreds of employers at the Poverty Alliance, on issues around wages. What do you think we could be doing to engage with them on the issues of progression, and specifically for BME groups?
I think first and foremost, because Scotland is a very friendly country, there is a general assumption that racism is understood, and that because people are friendly, the race is going to be friendly. And so I think first and foremost, we need to educate ourselves in the employment sector and in the workplace, really. Every time we do diversity training, we find that there are a lot of there's a lot of information that is not understood. Say, for example, last year we supported some organizations in to get candidates into the workplace. But one of the issues we faced, which was very surprising, because this was experienced in very well-established businesses, where the organizations, because of the lack of diversity, did not understand the actual documentation that migrants presented. And so one of the organizations where a young person, a young adult got a job, and the job was really, what they needed to check was the permission to work. And what they found was that this person had a residence permit, but because the organization did not understand the residence permit, they asked, and what they had was an indefinite leave to remain, actually. And they didn't know what an indefinite leave to remain was. And so they were asking for a refugee card, permission to work. But this young person had come to join the parent, the mother. And so they did not have the refugee card as was expected. And by the time we went through the whole process back and forth supporting the organization, the young person had completely and had moved on. And the organization it took us about 3 weeks to resolve this, just to explain to them that that is an indefinite leave to remain means they can actually work. And so there are things that are not understood. So diversity training and education on understanding the issues around minority ethnic groups, whether it is racism. And we also found in our research that while racism was experienced by employees, there was diversity blindness, where organizations felt that they were diverse enough because they had more women or because they had more disabled people, so they didn't feel that they did to increase their diversity, didn't think they had any issues. And so when these issues are experienced, they don't deal with them because they don't understand, and therefore they problematize the person. They don't realize that actually this is racism because it doesn't look like racism to the majority. And so first and foremost, education. I'll finish off by saying we've had a fantastic opportunity to work with some forward-thinking organizations. And interestingly, it is in the arts and in IT where they're thinking of a complete overhaul of looking at an anti-racist organization. So it's not just about not being racist, we need to be anti-racist. And so we're now working with organizations that are training all their staff members to be aware, so that in the workplace, the anti-racist culture is embedded, but also the issues that employees experience are addressed, and therefore it creates a healthy environment for progression and for diversity to be sustainable.
Thank you so much. So it does seem like it's a lot about education, and I'd recommend anyone on the call that is an employer or works for an organisation that's looking to do more on this to follow Pheona on Twitter or to look at Radiant and Brighter's website. We just have a few more minutes left. I'm going to go to a question for the panel about working parents or looking for work during the crisis and what support is needed given the specific challenges that they face. I don't know if either Alex or Laura want to jump in on that, if possible.
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit. I think it's one thing that the pandemic has done for us all is really given us a shake around flexibility. And I doubt there's anybody, and any organization or anyone that's certainly employed, and even going beyond employment, the need for new levels of flexibility around work have, they hit us all immediately. Lots of organizations that have said they never want anybody working at home had to let people work at home, and surprisingly, in most cases, it's been quite successful where it was feasible. And that in itself has created opportunities, but at the same time challenges for groups like working parents, where their children were at home. And we all, we had a laugh about this before the call started, about how challenging that can be. But organizations, I think lots of the most successful organizations, the most forward-thinking organizations are looking at how they can adapt and use that flexibility to provide good jobs, meaningful jobs for people, working parents, and the like as well. And I think that's important, because one of the things that's always been a challenge for that group is how you balance the almost, previously impossible balance of dealing with children and all of the requirements that they have around their education and childcare, the costs of that, the logistics in terms of hours that can be worked. These things dictated a lot of working parents' lives. Now there's a different way to readdress that balance through flexibility of organizations and their operating models. And then we need to think about that in terms of the design of employment support now, where people need help looking for work. How is that brought to the forefront? And it's another critical issue around, about inclusion and diversity, and how can we make sure that the good jobs that are created, take into account the needs of the likes of working parents, that they're not knocked out of that race to a job, or that competition for a role, because of the fact that they have kids, or they have caring responsibilities. And I think this is the kind of insight that needs to be brought to the forefront now, because things are being, old ways of thinking from a support level are being ripped up and thought about again. But as I said, I think in my chat earlier, things are being developed very, very quickly. So we need to bring things like this to that design process very, very quickly. And as Pheona pointed out, it can't come in right at the end. There can't be a sort of a last minute consultation on, what about working parents, or what about people within a certain sector. We need to be, thinking about that design inclusively the whole way through. So I think that's one of the things that I think the likes of the Poverty Alliance could certainly take forward to decision makers.
Thanks, Alex. I don't know if Laura was about to chime
in.
Yeah,
I'll just say two things really quickly. Totally agree with what Alex has said. The two things I'd say are, in terms of parents looking for work, I think in sort of times past, when it comes to programmes to support people to look for work, we developed across the country, across the UK, quite a wealth of knowledge about what works, and programmes specifically tailored to the needs of parents searching for work. I think one of my first jobs ever was evaluating the New Deal for lone parents, for example, that was developed in the 2000s. Were successful. We probably, at the national level, we probably moved away from kind of those specialist targeted employment programs to kind of big catch-all ones. But we do have that knowledge, and we can go back to it. So second thing is, and I'm sure you have covered the welfare system in other sessions of your conference, but I would just say, the families that rely on universal credit and tax credits and out of work benefits are typically those with children. The increases we have had this year have been really, really important. There's more to do, but they've been really important for those families. It's becoming clearer by the day this crisis is not going to be over by April next year. And so I think making families poorer by reversing that increase at that point in time seems like a really wrong-headed thing to do. That kind of financial support is just as important as the employment support.
Thanks very much. I'm going to finish up the session. I'm just going to thank, obviously, the speakers, but also everyone for attending today, and to let everyone know that part of the reason that we do these conversations, not only to get them going, is to inform the Poverty Alliance's strategic aims for 2021, but also our manifesto for the upcoming Scottish elections next year as well. So there's also a point in the chat about career progression and access to student loans, which will also feed in to that strategic document and our manifesto as well, and get our policy team to look up into that. So thank you again for everyone for joining. I hope you are all going to some more of the sessions this afternoon for the Poverty Alliance's annual conference. But for now, thanks very much again to everyone, and have a great weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.